Hi, I'm Tim Bruer and I'm a jazz pianist. Dan Tepfer is a pianist I first became aware of a number of years ago through his recording of Bach's Goldberg Variations, which involved him playing the pieces and then improvising his own variations upon them. Since that time, I've also come to know him as a consummate jazz pianist via the many live streams he's done during the pandemic, playing jazz standards, his own music, and free improvisations. I've also come to discover that he's into computer coding and the invention of his own musical technologies. Since striking up a bit of an online friendship with him, I thought it'd be interesting to have a discussion with him about his various musical pursuits. I began by asking him how things have been for him since things started opening up in the States and Europe. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Yeah, basically starting in about April, gigs really started to return. As soon as people started getting vaccinated widely in the U.S. and in Europe, the concerts returned, and I've been super busy. I have slightly mixed feelings about it, to be honest. It's really wonderful to be bringing music to people again. On the other hand, I just have mixed feelings about spending that amount of time in an airplane. So it's just something about being a professional musician who makes his living from concerts that I ultimately am going to have to figure out.
Okay, you don't like spending a lot of time on planes?
The glamour of touring, I think for me, wore off probably a solid 10 years ago.
Okay.
The glamour of making music, absolutely. It's not glamour, it's a profound privilege. And I remain as excited about that as ever, if not more excited, to be honest.
Yes.
But one of the things that this pandemic has raised is this possibility of playing for people all over the world through the internet. And
Yeah.
I've been amazed at how fulfilling that is, actually. And then I don't have to travel. So kind of
Yes.
an interesting wrinkle
That's
to be
right.
considered.
I mean, all of the commentators are talking about how things are never going to be the same again with people working from home, et cetera, et cetera. So I hadn't thought, well, I probably had given it a little bit of thought in terms of how it might be for musicians. But yes, that's what you say is right and interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, obviously there's a magic to live performance. For instance, last night I played at Mesro, that small club in Manhattan that you just mentioned, and
Mm.
there's an absolute magic in being in a room like that, really sharing a physical space with people.
It's a
Uh,
beautiful room. I love that room.
it's lovely, yeah. In the tradition of the old place Bradley's,
I never went
which
to
was a.
Bradley's, but I've been to Mesro a couple of times. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I love live performance. It's not that I would want to replace it entirely with live streaming, but I think there's some balance to be found there.
Yeah. Um, there was a question I had. Um, oh yeah, and I can't. I have shared your some of your Jack Trip stuff with quite a lot of people on Facebook who are saying, "Look, this can't be done," and I say, "Well, actually, it can." Here's a clip of. Usually, the one I put up is the one with you and Eric Harland and Jorge Roder, I think it was.
Hmm.
Um, there's just this magic trio playing across the internet, knowing that you guys are separated, particularly Eric, by a huge distance. Wonderful.
Yeah, like 130 miles, I think. But also a big thing affecting that stream was that Eric's children. He has, I think, three children, or maybe two. I think it's two.
Mm.
Were in school. Were in remote school. So they're all on Zoom the entire time. And he
Right.
didn't even have a fiber connection, so he's out there in the middle of the woods in Pennsylvania, and having to share his bandwidth with the kids. So it was a majorly challenging connection, but it really worked out great. I think in large part because Jorge and Eric are just so musical, and they were so game to bring their best to it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I had the pleasure of seeing Eric. He brought his band out to. I know you did a gig at 505 in Sydney many years ago.
I actually did one recently too. I did one in spring of 2019.
How the hell did I miss that? Hmm.
Yeah, played trio with Sam Anning
Yes.
and and oh darn, his name is escaping me. A really wonderful young drummer, Australian drummer. Um,
Which town do you know?
he lives north of Sydney. Alex Hurlian.
Oh yes. Yes.
Yeah.
He plays in my brother's band. My brother's a saxophone player. He plays in his band. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Mm.
Yeah, I was invited to play at the Canberra International Music Festival. I did a solo concert with the Goldberg Variations there. I did Natural Machines, and I played trio with Sam and Alex.
Wonderful.
And in addition to that, we booked some trio gigs in other places. So we played the 505. We played in Wollongong.
Right.
We played. I played also in Melbourne. I did Natural Machines there and did some teaching. So it was a nice little tour. And I also played with Kristen Berardi
Oh, of course.
In Brisbane.
Yeah. No, I don't know why that doesn't ring a bell. I remember when you did it the first time because I didn't know your name as well as I do now. But yes, Eric brought his band, just that Voyager band, and it's Julian Large and Taylor
Aaron
Oakes,
Parks, right? Oh, Taylor, right? Taylor.
Willie De Jones the third, and the Indian bass player whose name I can't pronounce.
Harish Raghavan.
Yes, absolutely. Like I had to send him a Facebook message afterwards. The music was so sensational. I just had to say, man, that was the best thing I've heard for so long. It was wonderful. It was so selfless. Everybody was just playing for the band. Taylor Oakes being the ridiculously great piano player he took about an 8-bar solo in the whole set. I thought, wow, that said a lot,
Wow. Yeah, Eric is a very profound, for lack of a better word, spiritual person. He brings just an incredible spirit to everything he does, and it's a very deeply cultivated spirit. I mean, his bachelor's is in religious studies, and
okay.
He's a true seeker. It really comes through in the music.
That's interesting. All right, now I thought I don't want to get into a long sort of historical thing because I've got so much I want to ask you, but I thought if you wouldn't mind, if you could just give us a little bit of a rundown on when you first started playing and when you first started improvising and just a little bit of background, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah. I was born in Paris in 1982, and my granddad was a jazz pianist. He lived in Eugene, Oregon on the West Coast. He's a wonderful player, actually, although he made his living as a university professor of English. But he was a serious musician, and he toured up and down the West Coast with Nancy King and Ralph Towner and Glenn Moore, the guys from Oregon.
Yeah.
And so he was an influence on me as a kid, because my mom was an opera singer. She sang in the Paris Opera Chorus for over 20 years. And so I grew up surrounded by classical music, and then through my granddad, surrounded by jazz, and very much influenced by this idea that you could make up music. So I started studying classical piano at the Conservatory in Paris when I was 6 years old, and very soon thereafter just started improvising very naturally. It just came very naturally to me to try to make things up. And I think I don't know if it would have happened without the example of my grandfather, but I just knew that was something that you were allowed to do, even if my classical teachers said you were not allowed to do that, which led me to learn very early that I just wouldn't improvise for them. But I spent countless hours at the piano as a child, just as a child and as a teenager, just inventing music. Because my parents, we didn't have a TV at home.
Oh, wow.
So
that's a real blessing on one level. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. We didn't have a TV, and this was mostly pre-internet. I mean, when I was 13, I think we got an internet connection that was incredibly slow. So there weren't a lot of distractions. I was also an only child, so I spent a lot of time just making music up at the keyboard, and eventually getting more and more into jazz. I was given some jazz CDs when I was maybe 7 or 8, and never looked back. It's kind of my whole life has been defined by that tension between written music and improvisation.
That's wonderful. It reminds me a little bit of Fred Hirsch's story, who I've been a big fan of for a long time. I've read his bio and watched many performances and interviews and things. And he was a bit similar in the sense that he came up with classical and was improvising, making stuff up before he got into the jazz thing. So you've been playing before you sort of got into the jazz side of things, be just improvising general music that was influenced by your classical training and maybe what, even pop music on the radio or something? Or
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of music in the house because my parents were both, both loved music, and my mom grew up singing jazz standards with her father, with my grandfather. And so she started teaching me jazz standards when I was, 7 years old or something like that. So that was a big influence. And I can't tell you exactly how I was making up the music I was making. It was probably influenced by everything I'd heard.
yeah,
I didn't really listen to that much pop music. I did listen to the Beatles a lot. We had a record of the Beatles. We had Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
yeah.
But aside from that, yeah, I think it was just kind of a hodgepodge of classical, jazz. I had a record of James P. Johnson,
Uh-huh.
the great boogie woogie player, and I also, when I was very young, I saw a documentary about Jerry Lee Lewis, Great Balls of Fire,
Yeah.
when I was at my grandparents' place, and immediately started playing boogie woogie. That was that was my big
He's
thing.
still with us. He's still alive.
Jerry Lee Lewis?
I'm sure he is. Yeah.
Hmm.
Incredible.
I wonder what he's doing.
I don't know. He was obviously an amazing character, apart from a
Oh yeah.
seriously good, like, rock and roll piano player. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you said something in one of your recent live streams about playing Gershwin with your mum when you were 7 or 8 or something, and I thought, were you actually improvising at that time, or were you playing from scores, or what might you have been doing then?
Yeah, I never had scores. So basically, the way it would happen is my mom would teach me the melodies, and I would try to figure out what the harmonies were.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them I learned relatively wrong. I
Yeah.
had to kind of learn them again a little later. And she would guide me too. She would say, "Oh yeah, that doesn't sound quite right," and I had recordings, so I'd learn the harmonies from recordings, and then for some reason, I think partially because of my grandfather's influence, but to be honest, I hardly really got any direct information from him.
Okay.
But somehow I was aware that you could learn these harmonies and then improvise within the harmonies.
Mm. Did you ever study the scores at all? I remember reading an interview with Keith Jarrett. I think it was a funny um, article in Downbeat many years ago with Don Gruze and Keith Jarrett, which would seem like, chalk and cheese. But it was actually quite interesting. And I remember Keith talking about, examining the scores, the Gershwin scores for all of the inner moving parts and so on, obviously being a real stickler for the original compositions and arrangements. Did you ever do any of that?
I have, but not at that point. That's something I got into probably in my mid-20s. Yeah, I have those original Gershwin scores. I have the original Cole Porter scores that are wonderful.
Yeah.
And yeah, they're beautifully written, and it really makes you understand at how deep the infrastructure under the surface of their music is. This is really what makes part of what makes this music so great, is that they had a very good understanding of tonal harmony and voice leading, counterpoint, and so they're able to bring all this infrastructure to a song that might be otherwise just a funny song or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. I actually met Dave Grusin when I said Don before, because there's a brother too who's a pianist as well. But yeah, that reminds me of those. I don't know whether you saw those things that Ethan Iverson put up recently, but he recorded a whole lot of the well-known standards that we play, but from the sheet music. And when you hear those versus the real book versions that we tend to have gravitated towards over the years, it was like quite an eye-opener in terms of some of the original harmonies. That was very interesting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my favorite example of that is Stella by Starlight.
Yeah.
Which, the way it's played by essentially the way it's played by most jazz musicians nowadays is the Miles Davis version, which has where they replaced all the diminished chords and the plagal cadences with 2-5-1s, because that was the hip sound then, and in fact it really greatly diminishes the harmonic tension in the tune. And yeah, if you go to the sheet music on Stella by Starlight, it's absolutely beautiful.
Mike Marino, the great guitar player, put up a Facebook thing a few years ago with copious examples of sheet music for Stella, and sort of broke it all down. I remember being really quite interested by that. I haven't revisited it, but yeah, I hear what you're saying there. Mm. Do you have perfect pitch, by the way? I suspect you do.
Yeah, I would have to say I do, but it's a little bit instrument dependent. It's most strong on piano. If I
Okay.
hear a piano note, I can usually say what it is very accurately. But yeah, it's like I have it, but it's. I've actually discovered that this is true of a lot of people with perfect pitch, that it actually varies, and often varies a lot through life. For example, my friend, well, I won't say who it is, but I have a good friend who had just astronomically great perfect pitch, probably until his late 20s. He's also synesthetic, so
Yep.
so there's just absolutely no mistaking one pitch for another. And he said that as he gets older, I mean, he's in his early 40s now, it just keeps getting kind of more and more muted. And the funny thing is, he's become a better and better musician, and he's an incredibly active musician. It's not like he's no longer engaged as seriously in music. He's more engaged than ever. But I've heard this from a number of people. It's a strange ability, perfect pitch, that is very much out of our control.
Well, I noticed that when Gary Burton retired, partially he said because he'd lost his perfect pitch, which
Yeah,
is probably quite sad for a guy like that. Well, I'm assuming it is.
very common later in life. But then again, perfect pitch is absolutely in no way a prerequisite for making music. Some of our greatest heroes did not have perfect pitch.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, people like Bach and Mozart did, and I often do align it with those geniuses. But I'm sure
But Stravinsky didn't.
Okay. Yeah, well, you probably know the great pianist Paul Grabowski that lives out here. He's a phenomenal musician, about my age, we're early 60s. And he has perfect pitch. And I remember he's on Facebook quite a lot at the moment. He said something quite derogatory about it, as though it wasn't necessarily that useful for him. So it's all quite interesting.
For me, it's really only useful when I'm playing. It's useful for picking up pitches that other people are playing. So for instance, doing free improvisation with somebody, especially in an atonal context. Because if you're in a tonal context, you can, it's actually faster to work out what note somebody is playing from the local harmony than to go with perfect pitch. And I think this is true for a lot of people. Relative pitch is usually much faster than perfect pitch. I mean, I'm sure it depends.
Relative pitch. There was something, but yeah, the reason why I thought you might have was that in one of your recent live streams, you sat there and you sang, and then you immediately went to the piano and played the same notes. And I thought, oh, okay.
Yeah,
So
it's a very intuitive thing for me. It's like, I think that's an A, right? Yeah. And I haven't played the piano. Well, I guess I played it just for a second right before, but that was that was a certain amount of time earlier. So usually it's there, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes I might just kind of somehow not be connected to that. So
that's interesting, because that's the first thing I do when I go to the piano in the morning, as I sing an A, and I'm probably, I don't know, 85% success rate, I suppose. Sometimes it's an A flat, sometimes it's a B flat. It's usually around there.
Here's something to try. For me, on the days when it's not right there, if I just hover my finger over the note, if I do that, I really hear it strongly inside. And I've actually talked to a number of musicians for whom this is true. So for example, guitarists will imagine having their finger on a certain fret. And then the sound will come.
That's a very interesting sort of physical brain connection thing, obviously.
Perfect pitch, we're talking about some kind of very reptilian, low-level ability that is, it's like super weird. And so, I think it is occurring at some habitual level. It's like, I know that if my finger is there, there's a certain sound that's going to come. And it's like a Pavlovian reflex kind of thing. But I think for a lot of people, you literally have to be sitting there physically, like just imagining it in your mind. Sometimes it's not quite enough.
The next main question I had for you, I'm just going to consult my notes, But what I find really fascinating about yourself is that you obviously have a incredible intellectual ability. And I know you studied astrophysics for a little while, and you're a whiz with computers and coding and all of this stuff. But when you play, and I've watched you play many times and never not enjoyed it, always thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
You seem to just immediately go into a creative zone, and you seem to have an instinctive way of just immediately going into that creative, in the moment, spontaneous zone. And I've always been really interested in the sort of, I don't know if dichotomy is the right word, but the difference between the conscious and the unconscious. And I'm wondering whether you had any thoughts about that, and whether you've perhaps paradoxically thought about that. What's your feeling about all of that side of things?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I have a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, I think I tend to be a relatively intellectual person, left to my own devices. Let me put it this way. I need to consciously connect to my feelings. They're always there, and I'm actually a very sensitive person, but I can easily kind of go into that rational place and dismiss feelings if I'm not careful. So as a result, I fear that if I had started music later, like say that I'd picked it up in my 20s or something, I don't think I would ever have opened that channel. For instance, I love playing tennis, and tennis, I think will always remain kind of a bit of a foreign language for me because I just didn't start it seriously enough early enough. But with music, because I was just spending kind of vast amounts of time playing, just improvising at the piano, starting from age 6. And also I think because it always felt like totally my own domain, because I was taking classical lessons, but virtually no one was telling me what to do in terms of improvisation. It just felt like I was playing. I was having fun making it music, and it felt very much like it was my own thing. Because of that, I developed this very kind of native language relationship to music from a very young age. And I would say the only thing that's gotten in the way of that was actually going to school for my master's. So I did my undergrad, my bachelor's in physics, in astrophysics, and then I did my master's in music at the New England Conservatory, which is a very serious school, and I was studying jazz there with some great teachers, Danila Perez, Bob Burkmeyer, and also going to New York to study with Fred Hirsch.
Yeah, I thought
and part of the thing that happened for me formally studying jazz so late was that suddenly it was a bit yanked out of me and put in this kind of more...
Sorry to cut across you there, but you mean by having to understand the nuts and bolts? Is that what you mean?
No, I had my own way of understanding the nuts and bolts. It's not that I was just going intuitively. I mean, you have to be organized in some way. Even somebody like Errol Garner, who didn't read music, was absolutely organized in his own way. I mean, there's no doubt about that. He had his own way of thinking about things, his own nomenclature, I'm sure. But there's no way that somebody is able to do that who just kind of goes out there and is like waving their hands around. So I had my own way of understanding things, and also I did talk to people, and I did take a few lessons here and there. There was a teacher in Paris called Bernard Maury, who was big on theory and all that. So I had context for what I was doing, but I always felt that what I was doing was kind of purely from the heart, plus this more structural context. But going to the New England Conservatory and being confronted with what I didn't know, and also being confronted with highly talented peers who might have studied jazz in a much more formal way much earlier than I did. So for instance, there are people who had learned all of Charlie Parker's solos and could play them in all keys, and things like this that I hadn't done early. This kind of put this thing called jazz into a much more anonymous place for me. Like okay, there are these general non-heart-based things that I need to learn to do well if I'm going to be a professional musician. And I think that was a bit of a struggle. I mean, it's similar. I think it's a similar story with composers who have composed their whole lives, and then, you know, aged 18 or whatever, they go to college, and suddenly they are told, well, actually, you know, what you're doing is very inspired, but you're lacking the depth of harmony and counterpoint that's behind it, and it's not really organized enough. And there's this quote, I can't remember who it's by, it might be Stravinsky, where he says in response to, it's probably not Stravinsky actually, but a great composer says in response, it might have been Messiaen, to a student complaining that she, you know, had her own music to write and didn't want to be told how to write music. This teacher said, well, if by clipping your wings you can no longer fly, they must not have been very big to begin with.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Just pretty brutal. But the point is, I think this is a pretty standard thing to have to go through, which is essentially if you're lucky like I am, you have this privilege of developing a very personal relationship to your art at a very young age. And then at some point, if you're going to become, you know, serious about it, you're going to have to kind of dismantle that.
You're going to have to find some way of conforming to some degree.
Well, I wouldn't say it's conforming, to be honest. I think it's more like a way of standing on the shoulders of giants. Perhaps there's some degree of conforming that occurs with that, but I don't think it's really so much about conforming. It's about literally taking the information in because otherwise you just can't be empowered by what came before you unless you actually delve deep into it. You know, for example, Mark Turner, the great saxophonist Mark Turner, was famous when he was, I think it was at Berkeley, for, you know, a certain period sounding exactly like John Coltrane, and then a certain period sounding exactly like Wayne Shorter, and then a certain period sounding exactly like Joe Henderson. Like he was just diving so deeply into these characters, and ultimately developed an unmistakably personal sound. So I think this is a common thing, you know, to have to dismantle this personal relationship you have to your art. And then after getting out of school, for me, it was this fight to reclaim my childlike joy in the music. And that's something I've had to fight for very consciously. It's like, I know what it feels like to have an absolute childlike joy in the music.
I love the way you're talking here. Love it.
And part of the difficulty of being a professional is that it's very easy to lose that. You do it all the time. You do it under stress a lot. Sometimes, you know, I was in the trenches for many, many years in New York City doing like background music gigs in hotels and in restaurants for like $80 a night. You know, sometimes you're playing in very much less than ideal circumstances.
Of course, yes.
The fight is to be an expert and to be a child at the same time with an unbridled joy in the music. And this is not something you can fake. You need to find things about the music that actually authentically give you joy. So that to me is the fight. Now, the other thing that I was going to say in response to your question, which let me see if I can remember what it was. I know there was another thing.
Balancing up the intellectual with the instinctive, really.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Thank you for reminding me. So the image that came to mind for me in that regard, I think it was in my mid-20s, I suddenly had this very clear image about this. I think when you're creating, there are really two people inside of you. There's a child with just this raw enthusiasm, this raw freedom, this non-judgmental quality. There's a child that's just running loose, just running all over the place, maybe like screaming and yelling and being just joyously creative. But the problem with this child is that there are cliffs around where the child is running, or there might be a car, there might be a street with cars. And this child is in great danger. And so there's also a parent. There's a parent who lovingly watches this child and kind of just redirects the child.
Back from the edge.
when need be.
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, let's not go over there. Let's go over here. And so for me, when I'm creating, I'm very much these two people at the same time. Um, I try to be both, and they operate at different speeds. The child, you could maybe say this is conscious and the unconscious, although I'm not sure those terms are exactly right because they can both live in a kind of a gray area between the two. But yeah, I'm those two people at the same time, just trying to have some kind of native, direct emotional connection to what I'm doing, and also some kind of higher level watchfulness.
Yeah, I really like your response to that. What it immediately triggered to me is something I say to students a lot, and that is that if you're playing a jazz standard in a typical fashion, and you play the melody, and then you improvise, and then you have to come back and play the melody again, that if you've done it right, you need to sort of suddenly get that overview or that overseeing part of you, when you come back to the melody, because then you need to get back to the sort of more organized, in inverted commas, aspect of it. And you can often hear, with great jazz performances, and of course, like most of us, we've listened a lot to Keith Jarrett, and you can hear, and I can think of other examples. I can even think of, I think it's when Joe Henderson comes back in with a melody on Blues.
Passion Dance. No.
And maybe it's Passion Dance or Blues on the Corner, but from that album, and there's a slight stumble, and they're moving from the creative headspace to a slightly more conscious headspace, And I mean, ideally, you want to sort of still, even though you've moved into that slightly more organised or conscious headspace, still sort of stay with your foot in the other camp, hopefully a little bit. But yeah, I've come to that similar thing, that you don't want to think too much. You try and get into a non-thinking zone, but you've sort of got this little part of you that's just sort of looking a little bit of an overview thing, just in a very broad way, that you don't want to spoil the playfulness, and this is sorry.
Well, I was just going to jump in and say that I would maybe personally, I agree with everything you said, except that I'm not so sure that for me there's less consciousness in improvising than there is in playing a known melody,
Okay.
Or for example, for me in improvising on a Goldberg variation versus playing the Goldberg variation itself. In fact, I work very hard to be 100% conscious of everything I play when I improvise. And this is something also that Lee Konitz stood for very deeply.
Yeah.
You try to not play anything extraneous, and really only play things that communicate meaning. And there's a consciousness there. Now, is it's an intention, it's a consciousness, and I don't think it's less conscious than when I'm playing something written, but I think you are right that when you're playing something written, there may be like a little more watchfulness, as in like, ooh, let's try to not mess this up, because there's less room for error.
It's probably the language I'm using, as I'm sure you are. The Kenny Werner book was quite a big book for me in terms of letting go and not thinking and all that stuff. But there was a wonderful Australian artist that you may not have heard. I'm pretty sure it was Sidney Nolan. He was famous for doing the Ned Kelly series, and you might not have heard of Ned Kelly, but he was a notorious bushranger in the late 1800s, early 1900s in Australia. Forgive me if I've got the dates wrong, but and his motif was this suit of armor that he built, which was like, I don't know how he even walked with the thing on, because it was like cast iron. But anyway, it had a complete sort of looked like a mailbox with just a slot for the eyes. So he's this iconic image, and this guy, Sidney Nolan, did a whole series of paintings. But anyway, the point of it was that I just remember being struck by seeing an interview with him, and he said, you have to learn how to paint, and then you're faced with a blank canvas, and you begin to paint using your craft. You hope you become absent-minded, and then suddenly there's a painting there. And this, to me, seems to be an archetypal kind of creative process that also goes on in the jazz improvisation, in improvisation, full stop. So that's the kind of area that I'm talking about, I suppose, and just to getting into another, a non-self-conscious space. And I suppose that doesn't necessarily exclude a certain consciousness as well. And obviously we're getting into a very, very fine splitting of hairs, but not unimportant splitting here.
Yeah, well, this is like in the realm of Zen and meditation. These discussions about consciousness, and indeed, I think in our conventional English nomenclature, there's a big difference between self-consciousness, which really means an excessive amount of consciousness of yourself that is paralyzing, and just consciousness, which ideally, according to Zen, is an extremely kind of smooth and even just awareness of things that are going on. Because
sorry, Dan. That means you can be observing whilst doing, but not
exactly.
not necessarily what's the word? Spoiling the process, for want of a better way of describing it.
And that's really what I'm talking about with the parent and the child, right? Is there needs to be an observer.
Contaminate was the word I was searching for, by the way.
Never mind.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was some really nice discussion there. I really, as I said in the Robert Levin interview.
Oh, sorry. I think I remember what I was going to say.
Okay, great.
Which is simply that this is all really different for different people.
Yeah.
I know what I was going to say. Yeah. So right. So this idea of an awareness. For example, in Zen, one of the traditional things you do is you sit and you watch your breath. But the real big challenge, most people misunderstand this, is that you're not supposed to be controlling your breath.
That's right. You're just observing it. That's correct. Yeah.
You're literally just observing. And that's actually a very difficult thing to do, to be aware of your breath, but not controlling, not saying like, okay, I'm going to breathe now. Just trying to let it happen and just still be aware of it.
Yeah.
It's really quite difficult. So that's really what we're talking about here when we talk about consciousness.
Getting out of your own way is another way of describing it.
Yes, but also being aware of your own way. Because there are two big dangers here. There's self-consciousness, which is going too far, this excessive amount of consciousness of what's going on that's paralyzing, right? But there's also not enough consciousness, which I actually think in my case, having had all these years self-taught, where I wasn't really thinking all that much, I think is the greater danger for me, because you can go to a place of really of self-indulgence, of going on too long, of being too insistent, of getting just too caught up in your own emotions without the awareness of the space that you're in, the people that you're playing for. The direct analogy is, if you're having a conversation with someone, not only is it essential to be aware of how they're receiving the information that you're communicating, but it's also essential to be aware of the space that you're in. For example, if you're in a restaurant, you don't want to be shouting, all these things. And so there's a danger in music, if you have a deeply emotional relationship to it, of losing awareness of all those things that may seem trivial, but actually those things are essential because they are what keep you connected to reality. And ultimately, reality is all there is. So if you lose that, you're kind of nowhere. So it's really this very fine balance.
Seems
very, very fine balance. It's like walking a tightrope.
Yeah, that's great, man. That's great. I really like that. That's the thing. As I said, was about to say about the Robert Levin interview, was when I first came up, and obviously I'm a little older than you, but I was very intrigued by all of this stuff, but there was nothing really concrete about it, because it isn't concrete stuff. And, I came up, I have to admit, probably with the Jamie Aebersold sort of play along thing, and, the Dan Hurl voicing books and all that sort of stuff. And that was all great and concrete craft building, information, etc. But I even remember there's these two books called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, I think. There were a couple of books that I read.
I have that.
Yeah, and I remember getting my wife to buy me both of those very early on, because I knew there was something there that I was missing, that wasn't sort of mentioned in the typical jazz education that I was going through at the time, which was the early 80s, and I did a jazz degree within a Bachelor of Music degree, and so my interest was always piqued, and I feel like I know a lot more about it now, and it's something I'm sure I'll keep thinking about.
Yeah, I love that book. I went through that actually, drawing on the right side of the brain, because I always enjoyed drawing, and obviously the science now, the neuroscience knows that this has almost nothing to do with actual left side of the brain and right side of the brain.
Right.
But at an experiential level, just this basic experiment she has in that book of getting people who consider themselves as completely talentless in drawing, getting them to copy a line drawing upside down rather than right side up, and realizing that then the result is about 10 times better than when they're drawing it right side up. It really drives home this idea that's so present in meditation, which is to try to not identify things, to just stay in the awareness of like, there's a line, and I'm just going to copy the line, as opposed to, oh, this is a face. I know how to draw a face, it has eyes, very similar.
Around the time I read actually it was after the Kenny Werner book, I actually started my master's degree thinking I would try and confront this topic, and it ended up being so slippery that I ended up changing and just doing a more standard thing on Keith Jarrett and doing some transcriptions. But one of the other books that's very obvious is the Inner Game of Music book, which is, of course, as far as I know.
I don't know that one.
You don't know that? Okay.
No, I know the Inner Game of Tennis, but I don't know the Inner Game of Music.
The Inner Game of Music, I think the Inner Game of Tennis was the first one, and then there was a series, and the music one was based on it. And the simple thing is just keep your eye on the ball.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's kind of what you were saying there about the line.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But I will also say that in some ways it's fun to talk about these things, but it's almost useless.
Yeah.
These are topics that you absolutely have to discover for yourself. And I think the only thing that really brings it is experience. You can talk about this all day and say nice sounding things about it, but if you're not actually engaging in the practice and letting these revelations come at some much, much more basic and a much more real level, you're not really getting it at all.
Absolutely, and I think I might use that as a segue to ask you if you could play for us. Just do some doing, if you like.
Sure.
Would that be okay?
Yeah, we were talking earlier about the original harmonies to Stella by Starlight.
This is what I thought. I did have another song in mind, but I suddenly think, I reckon maybe you want to give us your rendition of Stella, because I have never heard you play it before.
Yeah, I don't think I have played it in a very long time, but I think I can remember.
Oh man, you'll kill it. I know you.
Well, I think I can remember most of the original changes. First of all, the original I think is in G.
I was going to say G,
rather than B flat.
Yeah.
And it starts, instead of a 2/5, it starts on the 1 diminished, which is
the 1 diminished with the major 7th on the top. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, the melody is the major 7, so.
That's right.
Yeah. So let me try that.
Yeah, that'll be lovely, Dan. That'll be a real treat.
Okay, here we go.
Thanks, mate. That was beautiful, man. Thank you so much for that.
Oh,
Wow.
thank you.
That was
Thanks
just a
for that.
beautiful.
Thanks for that suggestion. Yeah, I haven't played Stella in a long time, and certainly not with those changes.
Well, that's one of the things that blows me away about you is how you can just play a song that you obviously haven't played for a while and just nail the hell out of it. It's wonderful. It's a really lovely dovetail. We not only that I felt that our minds thought alike in terms of choosing Stella, but that one of the other questions I had for you was about the influence of classical music on your playing and the way you, particularly when you're playing solo piano. And you've kind of answered quite a lot of that by just giving me the background you have. But the sort of the part of that I haven't, or the part of that I was interested in getting to was how much of that is, a conscious application of things you might have picked up from composers. How much of it is just seeped in by osmosis? Just explore that aspect of things.
Yeah, well, I think I have a kind of a interesting history with respect to this because my mom was an opera singer, so I was exposed to tons of classical music from even before I was born.
Yeah.
I was 9 months early in that respect.
Yeah. Wow.
Because she was singing in the Paris Opera, 4 or 5 nights a week. So
Such a
while she was
lovely thing.
pregnant.
Lovely.
And I also went through the French conservatory system starting at age 6. So I played a lot of classical music, a ton of Bach in particular, but many other composers as well. So on the other hand, my education, for example, you brought up Fred Hirsch earlier.
Yeah.
Fred Hirsch, his mom, in some bursts of intuition, got him a counterpoint teacher when he was like 8 or 9 or something crazy like that.
Yeah.
And so he was doing the fundamentals, the really hardcore fundamentals of counterpoint, which by the way are not easy,
Yeah.
at a very young age. And I didn't have that. The theoretical education I had at the conservatory was, a lot of solfege, dictation, which was really great. I'm so glad I got to do that. There was rhythmic training, things like that. But there was no really serious discussion of theory, which I really would have needed actually.
Yeah.
So I was very curious about how this stuff worked. And when I did meet jazz musicians, I was always asking them questions. And the reality is that I think until my late 20s, a lot of what I understood about the way harmony works was relatively intuitive, I would say. I did not have a solid understanding of what is making this stuff tick.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that you can do through intuition. I mean, for instance, my friend Thomas Enko, who's a very fine pianist in France, he's a fantastic musician, and he's not really interested in these theoretical things. It's all intuitive. Many people leave it at this intuitive stage. But for me, being somebody who loves science, and I think also wanting to understand how things work, I had a kind of a life-changing event in my life, which was in my late 20s, because of the success of my Goldberg Variations project and the fact that I was touring this project. I decided I needed to understand how Bach's music works better. So this was after I made the record, I made the record in 2011. I decided I want to understand what drives this music much better than, I did take counterpoint in college, but the way counterpoint is taught in college is extremely superficial.
Okay.
And I heard about a teacher who taught in Manhattan called Paul Caputo. And I studied with Paul, I think, for 2.5 or 3 years privately. And we did all the traditional Fuchs counterpoint, but not just the 2-voice version, which is what is often taught in college, or maybe you do 3 voices, but actually like all species in 2 voices, and then in 3 voices with the original clefs, and then 4 voices. And in conjunction with this, he taught harmony out of the Schoenberg Theory of Harmony book, which I think is absolutely fantastic, and has nothing to do with Schoenberg's 12-tone theory. It's all about...
It's not just the one called The Fundamentals of Musical Composition, is it?
No, that's one he wrote later when he was teaching at UCLA.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, he wrote a couple small books when he was teaching at UCLA, basically because he realized his students didn't know anything about music. So he wrote that, and he also wrote what's it called? Structural Functions of Harmony, I think, which is another small one. But his book Theory of Harmony, Harmonielehre, is a big book that he wrote much earlier when he was much younger. He was living in Vienna at the time. And it's very dense, so pretty hard to get through, I would say, on your own, although it's definitely possible. But studying out of that book with Paul Caputo and having him assign these very specific exercises out of it is really what made it work for me. And having gone through all that, I suddenly looked at Bach's music and realized I understood what he was doing. I mean, obviously there are many aspects of it that are probably things that I don't understand, but at a fundamental level, I can now look at most pieces of Bach and understand the mechanisms that are driving it. And that was just an absolute revelation for me. And then, in conjunction with this, I realized, wait a minute, this is how all jazz standards work. Anything written in tonal harmony works in exactly the same way, at a simpler level than the way Bach does it usually. But it's exactly the same stuff. And then I realized, okay, someone like Bud Powell, someone like Thelonious Monk.
Oh man, I was only watching Bud Powell last night. Oh, I can't get enough of Bud.
Well, these guys understood these mechanisms incredibly well. And in fact, that's how these guys get away with murder. They use these incredibly dissonant voicings, right? Like Bud, will do these like open major sevenths in his left hand. Monk will do these very dense chords with dissonances in them. The reason they can make this work is because the foundation underneath is super strong of this like ancestral conception of how tonal harmony works. It's really just a skin over this very traditional tonal structure that they're using. And so when I started to understand that, really some big doors opened for me. And I used to feel kind of embarrassed to play traditional harmony. It just felt like it made me want to squirm a little bit.
Okay.
And I realized that the reason it made me want to squirm is that I was an imposter at it. It wasn't a language I actually understood. It's kind of like I was aping the surface of it.
Yeah.
But that's not what's actually going on. The surface with these structures is really the least important part of it. It's like, if you look at an iPhone, it doesn't matter if the icons are organized in a certain way, or if the interface is organized in a certain way, or the colors are a certain way. It's really about like these profound mechanisms that are happening underneath it, like how the processor is working, the overall conception of how these things are organized. You can dress it up in any kind of way. It doesn't really matter. So this was intensely liberating for me, and it made using this kind of harmony into a real playground for me. That's just endlessly creative, and my work ever since then. I mean, over the last 7 or 8 years has been to try to be able to actually improvise this stuff.
I can't. Yeah, I love this discussion we're having right now. It's always been fascinating to me. It's why I was attracted to Robert Levin so much, to hear somebody improvise in the classical style. And with it, sorry.
I was just going to say, for me, it's not even about being able to improvise in the classical style. I mean, I love and admire Bob Levin, and it's wonderful that he can do that. But that's never been a goal of mine. I'm not trying to be able to improvise something that sounds like Mozart or sounds like Bach. What I'm trying to be able to do is improvise in my own language, which is probably some kind of big amalgamation of all the music that I've heard, but to actually be able to think through these underlying mechanisms of harmony in real time, and to be able to then dress them up however I want, which is what I'm doing in my project Inventions, Reinventions, where I'm playing the inventions by Bach, but then for the missing keys, because he only wrote 15 inventions and there are 24 possible major and minor keys, I actually improvise my own invention. And what that means is I'm really working hard to improvise in real time tonal structures that actually make sense according to the system that they were using at the time, and that basically supports common practice classical music, and also all of the 20th century music that's not avant-garde classical music.
Yeah, no, I do get that. I do get that. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's just
it's very challenging to do.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just loving what you're saying so much. But there are two things just before they disappeared from my mind. Was that one was that was interesting how in the earlier part of the conversation we're talking about the sort of instinctive thing that happened, the instinctive thing, and then getting into college and having to sort of get conscious about stuff, and then when you got out of college, go back. And it's sort of what you said about having to finally go into the depth into Bach and understand what's going on. Sort of there was a mirroring there in that process in the way you described that. And,
honestly, it's different for me.
Oh, okay.
I think part of the problem for me in college was that I didn't necessarily understand why I was supposed to do certain things. But for me, understanding, like true understanding, actually just suddenly realizing, oh, this is what makes this tick. Yeah. That is not paralyzing in the least. In fact, it's the absolute opposite for me.
Yeah.
It's absolutely liberating. It's absolutely empowering. It's like, my God, I can do so much now. I know how to do these things. I know how they work. Whereas I think part of the difficulty for me in college, and I think this happens a lot, is that something's kind of imposed on you and you actually don't quite understand why it is. In fact, there may be very poor reasons for it, is the truth. I mean, I found,
doesn't it?
Well, I studied with great teachers. I mean, absolutely great teachers. I'm talking, well, I shouldn't say necessarily great teachers. I studied with great musicians, some of the greatest musicians on earth, and I'm very privileged to have done so. But no one ever properly taught me tonal harmony. I mean, not even close.
Yeah, well,
and I know that at least one of the people I studied with actually does understand it well, but never mentioned it. And it's almost like this is some kind of little secret that people don't want to admit they're using or something. And I think also a lot of people don't really understand it because it actually takes a lot of time and practice to get that.
Very deep. Yeah.
Well, I know for a fact that a number of people don't understand it at all.
Right.
So and I'm talking like working musicians, Sorry, just to finish on this thought, the actual unlocking of the mechanisms for me is absolutely just freeing, liberating, empowering. It's just 100% positive. Not. I don't have to fight to then unlearn anything or anything like that afterwards.
I suppose the part that I was referencing was when you said, you finally realize you've got to stand on the shoulders of giants, and that's kind of what you're doing there. In that earlier part of the conversation. But just the other part, just before I forget, is I just finished the new Bach Reader, and I don't know whether you've ever read that, but if you haven't, man, you've read it?
Well, I can't say I've read it cover to cover, but I keep dipping in. Yeah, I have it on my shelf. Yeah.
I actually read it cover to cover, and I just loved it. I just loved it. And it really, some of the stuff you were talking about there in terms of the depth of his music and the different levels that it works on, that you were sort of trying to unravel in the playing of it, that really, it clarified, not to any specific degree, because it's not a technical workbook, but it gave me an insight into the number of levels that it's working on. And there's enough scholarly descriptions in there for that to have really piqued my interest. So that's
a wonderful book.
Yeah. And I mean, that whole thing of just trying to imagine what it's like being back in that day and being, I remember Andras Schiff saying, imagine being able to actually see Bach play the organ, and, those things just give you goosebumps, and reading a book like that is kind of almost the closest you can get to that, because you've got anecdotes of people that were there when he actually played,
Yeah, although I think it's really interesting to think that the thing that means that we are unable to experience Bach improvising, which is the absence of recording in his time, right? As sad as it is that we can't hear that, and I think it is tragic, it is also the only reason that he wrote so much music down on paper. Right? I'm absolutely convinced that if he could just record, he would have been like a jazz musician, like he would have been improvising all the time, and like Keith Jarrett, like just.
That's right. Well, that's really interesting you said that, because in that big documentary called The Keith Jarrett documentary on
Oh,
improvisation, whatever it
yeah,
is.
the art of the improviser or something. Or no, I forget what it's called, but yeah, something about
Anyway,
improvisation.
at one point he says, "Oh, look, we don't know how Bach improvised," and I thought, as much as I absolutely adore Keith Jarrett, he's probably my favourite musician of all time. It's not actually quite true, because we have a pretty good idea of probably what it would have been like. I think from what, if you really study the treatises and the anecdotes, you know, and the book that CPE Bach wrote that I've recently acquired but not looked at, and I think you can get a pretty good idea. And I recently thought that the Fantasia in D minor, you know, the chromatic Fantasia, and which I've started learning myself, that just, as much as this is my own take on it, that when I first heard it, I thought, I can imagine that would be the way that Bach would sit down and just start improvising. Now, you know, we don't really
Well,
know.
I think that's one way that he could improvise, but I'm sure that he also, you know, we know that he was able to improvise fugues.
Yes.
So like, you know, a chromatic fantasy, I'm sure that's one type of freer improvisation.
Yeah.
Like for him, that was maybe like a free improvisation.
Yeah.
But he was also able to improvise within these very
I
strict
know.
forms, like fugue, you know, which are not chromatic, where he's like going to very specific keys related to the home key and all that. I mean, the interesting thing about Bach is that we know for a fact, as you're saying,
Yeah.
that his improvisations must have sounded very similar to his written music. I mean, I'm absolutely sure that he would not have been able to improvise the incredibly complex canons, you know, of the Goldberg Variations, or of the art of the fugue, or sorry, of the musical offering.
Well, there's obviously evidence about that exact one, the musical offering. To that point, you know, he couldn't quite get he improvised the 6-part once. He had to go home and write it out. Yeah.
Well, he was challenged to improvise a 6-part fugue.
Yeah.
So he improvised a 3-part fugue.
Yeah.
On that theme. He was able to do that, and then he was challenged to improvise a 6-part fugue, and he said, well, you know, some themes don't lend themselves as well as others to being improvised with so many voices. And then he went home, and as this like giant fuck you, he sent back this like unbelievable work, the musical offering. But I was actually referring, he could improvise fugues, but I was referring to the canons in the musical offering.
Yeah.
Which
right. Yeah.
You know, just are at a level of complexity that I mean, who knows? But there's no written record of him improvising canons that I know of, and the amount of calculation involved in doing that in real time seems impossible to me.
Yeah.
But what I was getting at here is that it's kind of interesting with Bach, because we can know certainly that when he improvised, it was in the same style with the same mechanisms that he used in his composition. Now that's completely different from another great improviser like Olivier Messiaen, where his improvisations were in like late Romantic style, whereas his compositions were using a completely different set of musical materials. You know, all these modes of limited transposition and these very complex rhythmic ideas. I've actually worked hard in my life at being able to improvise within some of Messiaen's harmonic and tonal language. But when he improvised, and he improvised all the time in the church on the organ, if by all counts it was like late 19th century style.
Well, there's stuff there's stuff on YouTube, right?
Actually, I didn't know that. I have to hear that.
Yep, there's him improvising on the organ on YouTube. Yeah.
Okay, I have to hear that. But what I'm saying is correct, right? About how it is stylistically.
Look, I'm not an expert on Messiaen, but I do hear what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, this is my understanding, and I think it's interesting to think about that you're right, that Bach, certainly his improvisations were in that same style.
I honestly think that's the most perfect segue for you to play a short Bach piece and improvise on it, if you would do us that favor. Is that something you'll be?
Sure. Yeah. Maybe I'll play 3 of the Goldberg Variations and improvise after each one.
Whatever suits your fancy.
This is something I do in my program, Goldberg Variations, where I play all 30 of them. I have 3 concerts of this program coming up in France, and I'm looking forward to them.
I'm sure you are. Lovely. Thanks, Dan.
Here we go.
Man, I really, really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed that. Yeah,
it's
go
kind of,
on.
I was going to say it's kind of hard to jump into that. It's really this like huge adventure, you know, playing the Goldberg Variations and reacting to each one. And I feel a little funny just doing a little excerpt like that, but you know, I think it's a good exercise as well. But very much when I perform this, it's about this real like
Journey of it.
long range journey. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can well imagine that. I mean, that aria at the beginning, I mean, talk about sublime pieces of music and a way to get started. I mean, well,
Yeah, it was so simple. I mean,
yeah,
people argue about whether Bach wrote it himself at all.
yeah, okay. There
You
is
know
more
that
of
that
that sort of
melody
thing
is
coming to
like
light
is
these
like the
days. Sorry?
what's that?
There's more of that sort of thing coming to light. You know, that classic little minuet in G, da 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 da. Da. That's not him.
It doesn't sound like Bach, that piece.
Yeah.
But the aria, the funny thing about the aria is that it's like the only thing that there's almost nothing there. It's basically like the actual melody is a.
Yeah.
That's the melody, and then it's just embellishment.
Oh.
But this is a really fantastic example of what I was talking about earlier, which is that Bach understood this dichotomy between the subterranean and the surface so deeply that he knew that if the structure underneath is strong, which it is incredibly strong in that aria and in, you know, the structure of all of the pieces in the Goldbergs, you really don't have to do much to make it compelling. You know, it's just the right amount of variation, very subtle amounts of variation in the ornamentation, because everything is so pristine, everything is done just right. So it doesn't have to be crazy, you know?
Yeah,
It's so simple.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously many of his works in credit for keyboard, which I'd have to say is the lion's share of what I've listened to. I mean, they're incredibly busy. There's not a lot of space in them, but that one is so spacious. And so you don't seriously think that he didn't write that, or?
I think he probably did, but you know that bass line, which that's the foundation of the Goldberg. It's just that, because then it's just that bass line gets transposed, right? The second time around it goes. So it's exactly the same, except the last 4 notes get moved up a fifth, you know, and then the second in the second half of the form, it's again the same thing, but going to E minor, and then finally the same thing going to G minor with just very, very subtle displacements of groups of notes. So to me, it's almost like he took that bass line, which obviously existed at the time, and I think there's historical evidence of other pieces that predate Bach that use that bass line. I mean, there's no way that wasn't used, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
It's like the world's most obvious melody, and on top of that, he's putting nothing. He's putting nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking like nothing. It's nothing.
But it's also profound. The simplicity, to me, I know he didn't write that right at the. I can't remember exactly. You know, I can't remember exactly where it was in the trajectory of his life. I know the art of the fugue was the last thing, but it still strikes me as being an incredibly mature distillation. You know, almost
absolutely.
Nothing going on,
Well, when I say nothing, I don't mean that in any kind of derogatory way. It's quite the opposite.
In the best possible way.
He knows how little he has to do.
That's right.
Which
like
is that's true mastery.
2 profound notes.
Yeah, and Lee Konitz also was a true master in that respect.
So I've got 2 other things I'd like to touch base with you on, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
One is the idea of the metronome, and I watched a roundtable discussion that Ethan Iverson hosted once, and it was him, it was Kenny Barron, it was Joanne Brackeen, and it was the late Harold Mayburn. And people of my generation, even I know Ethan's younger than me, and so is yourself, but I sort of came up in a generation where we all just got a metronome, we all played to it. But when he asked all three of those guys, they just never used one in the way that I have used.
Well, I know that's not true of at least one of those guys.
Okay.
I mean, I won't divulge who, but that's just not true.
Okay. Well, maybe there's a bit of pride going on or something.
I think there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors happening in some of this. I mean, like I don't know whether Chick Corea ever used a metronome, but I know that he's said publicly that he didn't. I find that extremely hard to believe, given what his music is like. I mean, who knows? But I do know for a fact that some musicians who might say publicly they don't use a metronome, in fact, do. And
so, do you? What's your feeling? Have you used it much? Is it an essential tool for you?
It's an essential tool for me. Yeah, absolutely.
I thought so. Yeah.
I think. Well, I consider myself rhythmically challenged. You know, I consider it a real. Like, I think I'm talented for melody, for example.
Okay.
I don't think I'm talented for rhythm. It's something I have to work on really hard. Although I have had some hilarious discussions with some absolute rhythmic masters who say, "Oh yeah, I'm bad at rhythm too." You know, so it's almost one of those things where you have to recognize that you're bad at it in order to be good at it. But in my case, I authentically think I'm just like untalented at rhythm. So.
I mean, I suppose it's like all of the other elements of music. It's so multi-layered, you know. There's so many aspects to it, you know.
Well, it's infinite.
Yeah.
And ultimately, if you want, rhythm is one of the things where once you think you've got it, I think you're in big trouble. It's like, you know, rhythm keeps you humble in the same way that, you know, you're supposed to be humble in all the religious practices. Like you don't fly too close to the sun, and you certainly don't ever think you're on God's level or something like that. Rhythm is kind of like God, you know, and you bow. At least I bow humbly in front of it, or I try to.
Well, I've always been impressed with, you know, when at times when you've said, what key do you want me to do this in, what time signature, and you've done something in 11, and I've gone, wow, this guy's done some homework, you know.
Oh yeah, I mean, I work at it hard, you know. But this is my point: is that the metronome for me in practicing rhythm is an essential tool. Now, you know, I've developed actually an app called Double Time Metronome. The point of which is to keep the metronome from being something that you lean on. You don't want to lean on a metronome. That's really important. So Double Time enables you at the touch of a button to double the amount of time between metronome clicks. And so eventually what you can do is you start playing with it, or maybe I should give a demonstration of this.
Sure.
So you start here's Double Time Metronome. And so let's say this is a random tempo. It's at 110, and it's beeping every two beats.
Yeah.
Okay. So
yeah.
1, 2. So what I would do is like, I'll play all the things here are. And now I feel comfortable in that tempo, I'm going to double it. again, now I'm comfortable there. Another doubling. So that's, that's pretty slow. I mean, where it's gotten to here, right?
Sorry, say that again?
It's like, there's a lot of time between these metronome clicks at this point, right? So there's the only way that I can be, could you hear the metronome all right, by the way?
Yes. I when you said doubled, I took a minute to understand what you meant, and I got it. Yeah.
So we're doubling the amount of time between the clicks.
No, yeah, got it, yeah.
That's super, that's so long between these metronome clicks, right? It's like 1, 2, bang.
I can't believe the amount of synchronicity that's going on here, because my current thing that I'm doing, obviously I don't have access to that technology because you've just invented it.
It's on the App Store if you want to check it out.
Okay.
Like, if you have an iPhone.
What I've been doing is, because I really, when I listen to people with rock solid time, I mean, I've always worked on my time, but I've had a habit of speeding up, like a lot of people, rushing a bit. And so what I'm doing at the moment is taking things, particularly in 3, I find 3 gets away really quickly, the lilting nature of 3. So I'm choosing a fairly slow tempo and, begin where I think it should be and have the metronome set, and then just click it in, take the hand off and click it in, and then just click it out and, work through a piece like that. And I'm getting better and better at it, but that's a much more rudimentary way of doing something not dissimilar to what you're doing there. So that's a very interesting bit of synchronicity there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think people have done these kinds of exercises in many different ways. I actually got the idea from this from John McNeil, the trumpeter.
Yeah, I've met him actually.
Wonderful guy, very profound guy, and he would advise you to make a tape, because that was the technology at the time, where you would get a metronome that just had a light, so it could be quiet, but it would blink, right? Yeah. And so at first you'd give yourself like 8 bars of, so you just like snap your fingers or something to the light, and then you'd go like once every 8 beats or whatever. And I did that, but I found that it was annoying being beholden to that particular progression. And what I really wanted was to be able to, at the touch of a button, decide, okay, I think I'm in the tempo now, I think I'm relaxed into it, I think now I can double the amount of time. And like when I'm actually doing this exercise seriously, I can go way further than what I just did and still be right in it. And so I think the big advantage to this is, obviously this is still using a metronome, but there's no way that you can rely on the metronome here. The time has to be like coming from deep inside.
Just strengthening your own inner pulse.
Exactly. Yeah.
I always say to students, play with the metronome, but make sure you don't play with it as well.
Right, but I think that's really hard to do if the metronome just keeps going. Like, it's tough to. The other thing that I like to do, and this was taught to me by Ben Street, is put the metronome really quickly. So it's kind of the opposite. So let's say, I'll do it a little slower at first because it can be hard to hear what's going on otherwise. So this is 152. And that's going to be on the upbeats of every beat. 1, 2,
Wow, okay,
3,
yep.
4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. So for example. Okay, and then that, you know, I find that for a lot of people that's already really challenging at 150, but like doing it more like at 200 gets pretty interesting. Like, so that's pretty challenging. I mean, you know, I advise people to start a lot slower. Like a lot of people
absolutely.
might have to start like around
very impressive, man. It really is impressive.
You might want to start like around 100 or something, you know, like. And then get it faster. The nice thing about doing this is that it forces you to pay attention to the metronome almost like you'd pay attention to a drummer. Yeah. Because it's just so kind of counterintuitive to have all those upbeats that you have to just be listening to it in a much deeper way than just like plunking the downbeats down.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
I love the kind of tension between those two exercises. They're kind of doing opposite things.
That's really great, man. It's really great. You answered my question so well. So I think we've done quite a lot of talking, and you know, this has been a wonderful experience for me. It's so inspiring. I thought maybe if you could just talk very, very briefly, and I feel like with Robert, I could do this another 2 hours of this, and maybe we can reconvene. But you talked recently on a live stream about how you consciously worked on your free improvisations and setting up the ability to tell a story. So I thought if you could talk very briefly about that, and then just do a very brief free improvisation to finish off for today, I would be so pleased if we could do that.
Yeah. So you know, this question comes back to the topics we were touching on earlier, which are how do you do more in music than just touching the surface? Touching the, you know, like creating a pleasing surface. How do you work from underlying mechanisms that make things tick at a deeper level? And I have always loved free improvisation. And like you, I'm a fan of Keith Jarrett's, and I love his free improvisations. And I've been in free improvising since I was a kid. You know, I just love making stuff up. Yeah. But what I found is that, you know, the way I was doing free improvisation was very much following my nose. It's like, okay, I'm here, and now it feels like I want to go here, and now it feels like I want to go here or there. And as a result, I think things can feel very meandering. Yeah. Thomas Addis, in his book of interviews, the great composer Thomas Addis, he talks about music that is fungal. You know, like Wagner's music is fungal. Like it's just kind of in one place and then it goes to another place. It spreads. Okay. As opposed to you know, the music of somebody like Bach or Mozart, you know, that has this like overarching structure. You are going places that really make sense. I don't want to say that Wagner's music doesn't make sense. I mean, it's good music, but it kind of meanders, you know.
Okay. And I don't know his music very much at all, to be honest. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I really had that feeling in my free improvisations, which is that sometimes I got lucky and I got inspired and it somehow worked, but there was this sense of, okay, I'm in this place and maybe I'll go to that place. And what I wanted to do once I started understanding how tonal harmony works is be able to choose to make up harmonic adventures in real time that make sense. And harmonic adventures in tonal harmony really have to do with creating tension and releasing tension within the available destinations of a key.
Yeah.
And also modulations.
Yes.
So you can modulate to keys, but you can't modulate to just any key. I mean, I guess you can, obviously, but within that system, that is a deeply coherent system. It's like the grammar of a language or something.
Yeah.
You don't modulate to just any key. You modulate to related keys.
Yeah,
and this got stretched.
On my wavelength at the moment. I'm doing similar things at home myself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So these keys that you can go to get stretched in history. People go to further and further removed keys. But in any case, I wanted to be able to improvise these kinds of harmonic adventures, authentically, like without having planned anything, but within this system. And I found that to be incredibly compelling. Like, it's just so fun. It really engages my mind. I think this is one of the challenges that I have with improvisation, is just finding something that absolutely occupies my mind, so that the ego doesn't even have like the time or space to really assert itself. That's what I love. That's what I love in difficulty, and doing difficult things. And I think some of my heroes, people like John Coltrane, for example, I'm convinced that he was driven by something similar. I might be wrong about that, but I think that might be the reason for why he wrote all that difficult music.
I hear what you're saying there. Yeah.
So yeah, that's the basic idea, is being able to create a harmonic adventure, and then also this idea that who's going on the adventure. And for example, the inventions in Bach, the adventure, the character, our protagonist in the adventure, is a theme. It's often a melodic theme, but it doesn't have to be a melodic theme. It could also be kind of a textural idea, or, for example, the idea of arpeggiating triads, or it's some kind of idea, which at the simplest level is like that. This idea is carried on this harmonic adventure. So that's what I try to do, and I find it really interesting because it's limitless. It's like, there are all these options about what to do at all times.
Yeah, excellent. You want to put that into practice for us?
Okay, I'll try. Yeah, you want to give me a time signature?
Oh, a time signature. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we do just 3/4? I was talking about 3/4. I know it's not. It's totally unrevolutionary.
Yeah, that's fine. And how about a key?
E major.
E major in 3/4.
I love E major. Yeah, I love those sharp keys. Yeah.
It's got a brightness to it. Okay, so I'll do a free improvisation in E major in 3/4, and I think I'll just make up some kind of a theme.
Thanks so much, Dan.
My pleasure.
Oh, I'm having to fight back the tears here. That is just,
Oh man.
that was just so beautiful, man. I loved
Oh,
that.
thanks. That's way too kind, man.
Oh, no, it's not. It was gorgeous. It was
Thanks.
gorgeous. I just, yeah, I love, I loved everything about that. And I mean, I could go on for the next half an hour about what I loved about it.
Oh, thank you.
I
Yeah, I
really,
mean, it's just I'm really happy that it's something that I have to keep maintaining. And actually, to be perfectly honest, I'm a little off the bandwagon right now. But I'm very happy that these ideas have become kind of a playground for me. It's like I know that going into that world where chords are relate to each other in certain ways is just is really rewarding. So it just feels like a happy place I can go play, and
totally, man.
that's very
I mean,
fun.
this is so great for me if I'm looking at it selfishly, but I really I just want people to see what you do and hopefully gain something out of this conversation. But it's really rewarding personally to hear you talk about how specific you are harmonically with this stuff and how much thought's gone into it and how much sort of I suppose thought's the best way of describing it, and thinking it in a very concrete way in terms of structures and so on, and the things you've referenced, infrastructures and so on. Because this is what I've when I've done a little bit of this, not nearly as much as you, but that's what I've kind of come around to that way of thinking in terms of the way I need to proceed. Yeah, it's just.
I mean, that's how all the good music is made. I think.
All the good music. Sorry.
I think it's how all the good music is made. I mean, it's like good buildings have good bones. It's like.
Yeah.
And we when you think of the structure of an animal, it's so brilliant. We have the skin, but there's these miraculous things constantly happening inside of us at all times. It's not good enough to have just the surface.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously Bach is often revered for the perfection in the architecture and the spirituality. And I remember Bill Evans said something similar about if you get the architecture right and you add the human element, that's when you get it. That's when it starts to happen. And it's the same thing, of course.
I don't know that Bill Evans quote. That's a wonderful quote. I would love to hear the original quote for that. I don't know that quote. So he said, if you get the architecture right and you add the human, then that's where the magic happens.
Yeah, they're the two. I'm sure they're the two key words in the phrase. It's probably a slightly paraphrased, but they're the two key words. Yeah.
If you can find that, I would love to hear the exact quote, because that's something I talk about a lot, about my favorite music existing at the intersection of the algorithmic and the spiritual.
Okay, well, I mean, I don't have a pen to write that down, but obviously when I review this video, I'll make a mental note to search for the quote, and I'll happily email it to you.
Cool. Yeah, sounds great, man.
Look, so thank you so much, man. It's been an honor to spend time with you and to have you give so much in terms of your information and your music. I am humbled by the time you've
oh yeah, it's been a long time, hasn't it?
Sorry?
It's been a long discussion. Yeah, I like talking about this stuff.
So do I, and I really like the in-depth thing, and I thank you once more for that. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, man.
Thanks so much, Dan. It's been a real pleasure, and I'll be in touch.
Okay.
Thanks, man.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.